The knock at my door that morning still echoes in my head. I had been balancing a box of dishes on my hip, sweat running down my back from hours of unpacking, when the courier shoved a thick envelope into my hands. I signed without thinking, balancing the clipboard against the doorframe. Only when I set the dishes down and noticed the name typed neatly on the label did my stomach flip over. It wasn't addressed to me. It was for him, my mother's ex-husband, the man I thought I was finally free of. His name, on my brand new apartment lease address. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I tore the seal thinking it was some clerical mistake, but the language inside made my blood run cold. It was another rent reminder. In his name. The system showed him as the primary tenant. I was just... what? A guest in my own home? A shadow still trailing his paperwork? I collapsed onto the half-assembled couch, staring at the letter. It didn't make sense. I had found this apartment myself, filled out the applications, wired my own deposit. My name was printed on the mailbox downstairs. But here it was in black and white. He still somehow held the leash wrapped around this place, like he had secretly extended his reach into my life after the divorce. My first reaction was disbelief, then fury. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone. Should I call the leasing office? My mom? Him? Was this deliberate or some glitch? Yet, beneath all the questions, one thing was certain. This wasn't going to be simple. When I thought I had escaped, a piece of him had followed me here. You might think this is just paperwork, that I'm overreacting. But tell me, how would you feel if the very walls you were unpacking into, the first space that felt like it was finally yours, turned out to still belong on paper to the one person who had spent years trying to control you? Even before I had answers, I knew one thing. He wanted it that way. But the cruelest part wasn't the envelope itself. It was what happened within the next 24 hours, when I confronted him and saw just how intentional it all really was. Shall I write the next chapter? When I showed up at my mom's house that evening with the envelope in hand, she looked exhausted before I even spoke. "Please," she said softly, "don't start again." But how could I not? I dropped the letter on the kitchen table. His name in bold print stared up at both of us. "He doesn't even live here anymore," I snapped. "Why is everything still tied to him? Why is my lease under his name?" She bit her lip and fiddled with the edge of the tablecloth, like she'd been rehearsing this moment in her head. "He helped during the application process," she finally admitted. "The landlord was more comfortable having an older, established tenant listed as the primary. He said it was just for security. You wouldn't have gotten the place without him." That word, security, made me feel even more trapped. I could still hear his voice in my head, calling me reckless, saying I wasn't ready to make decisions without someone looking over my shoulder. And now, even in this new apartment, his name was literally stamped above mine in the records, as though the space wasn't mine at all. "Mom, do you realize what this means?" I asked. My voice shook, but I held her gaze. He could walk in any time. He could cancel the lease. I could be left out on the street with every box I just unpacked. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Don't be dramatic. He wouldn't do that. He just wants to make sure you're stable." That's the excuse she always used. His controlling behavior cloaked as concern. Except the truth was darker. He didn't want to let me go. Even after the divorce, he clung to these tiny hooks in my life, as if he still owned pieces of me through paperwork and contracts. I wanted to scream. Instead, I forced myself to say it slowly, so she heard every word. "This is my home. He has no say here." But even as I said it, I wondered if the law, or worse, his manipulations, would prove me wrong. And when he showed up at my door 2 days later, jingling keys as though the apartment was his, My worst fears came true. Shall I write the next chapter? The sound of keys rattling in the lock sent a shockwave through me. I was slicing vegetables for dinner, finally settling into some rhythm of normalcy, when the front door handle jiggled. For a split second, I thought maybe I had forgotten to bolt it, but then I heard the unmistakable scrape of a key sliding into the lock. I froze, knife in hand, pulse pounding. The door swung open, and there he was, my ex-stepfather, leaning in as if it were still his house. No knock, no text, no warning. Just him, taking up all the air in my apartment. "Relax," he said casually, like he was the one caught off guard. "I was just making sure everything's okay. The landlord dropped some mail at my place again." He held up a flimsy envelope in one hand, while dangling the keys in the other, smirking like he knew exactly what he was doing. I put the knife down hard on the counter. "Why do you even still have those? Why would you think that's okay?" His eyebrows lifted as though I was the unreasonable one. "It's not my fault. The lease is in my name. I'm responsible if anything happens, so, of course, I need access. Someone has to keep an eye on things." That's when I noticed the way he scanned the apartment, his gaze lingering on the books I'd neatly stacked, the photo frames I'd propped up, even the laundry basket by the couch. It was exactly how he used to sweep through my old bedroom years ago. Like my space was not mine, but part of his domain to oversee. I felt a sick mix of fury and helplessness. "This is my home," I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "You don't just get to walk in here." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You always make everything so dramatic. You should be thanking me. Without my name on that lease, you wouldn't even be here. I'm protecting you." That word again, protecting. To him, control and protection were the same thing. And just like before, I knew he was setting me up to look paranoid if I told anyone. My mom would defend him. Neighbors might think I was ungrateful. But then something shifted. A neighbor from across the hall had stepped out with her trash bag and paused, watching us. Her eyes darted between me and the man standing inside my doorway without permission. She raised her eyebrows, clearly uneasy. For the first time, someone saw. I almost wanted to thank her, right there in the hallway, because I realized this wasn't just me versus him anymore. There were witnesses now, and witnesses meant I finally had leverage. Shall I write the next chapter? The next morning, I ran into that same neighbor by the mailboxes. She gave me a look that said, "I heard everything." Before I could even explain, she leaned closer and whispered, "He shouldn't have keys if the place is rented in your name. You need to talk to management." Her words stayed with me the entire day, but when I brought it up to my mom on the phone, she sighed like I was blowing everything out of proportion again. "If he had a key, it's only because he wants to make sure you're safe. He's not out to hurt you. Don't twist it into something it's not." I wanted to shake her. Not what it's not. He literally walked into my apartment without permission. How blind could she be? That's when I realized the first real injustice wasn't just him barging in. It was the way the people closest to me minimized it, brushed it off, made me seem like the one stirring up conflict. Still, I tried to ignore the gnawing pit in my chest. Maybe it really had been just about dropping off mail. Maybe if I focused on my work, it would fade away. But a few days later, another envelope arrived in the wrong name, and this one hurt more than any trespass could. It was a friendly reminder about rent due. Not to me, the one who had already set up auto payments under my bank account. No, it was addressed squarely to him again, as if I were just a guest piggybacking off his generosity. My efforts, my independence, they didn't register at all. When I asked him about it over text, his response dripped with smugness. "Don't worry about it. Everything's being taken care of." Taken care of. Like I was a child playing at adulthood, and he was magnanimously cleaning up my messes. That was the first time I realized he might not just be conveniently still on the lease, but actively keeping it that way. And his little visits didn't stop at that one incident. A week later, I came home to find a sticky note on my kitchen counter. Fridge makes a weird noise, called maintenance. T. He'd been inside. Again. You called maintenance? I muttered aloud, shaking with rage. He wasn't only intruding, he was performing ownership, as though this apartment, my first independent step, was still under his dominion. I knew then that no matter how small these acts seemed individually, they were carving away at me piece by piece. First mail, then keys, then notes. It was a slow erasure of my autonomy. And if I didn't step up, the next erasure could be something far bigger, like my right to live there at all. Shall I write the next chapter? The night after finding his sticky note, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the pipes sounded like his key scraping the lock again. My own apartment felt watched, violated, like I was living as a tenant inside his invisible prison. I decided to push back. The next morning, I texted him directly. You cannot come into my apartment whenever you feel like it. Stop using the key. This is my home. His reply came within minutes. Your home? Don't flatter yourself. The lease is under me. I'm doing you a favor letting you stay there. I have every right to make sure the apartment is in good condition. My hands shook as I read it. The gall. The twist. He was shaping it like I was an ungrateful squatter in his place. I called my mom immediately, her voice thick with irritation, before I could finish reading the text. He's paying on your behalf. What's the big deal? I shouted back. I've been paying rent with my account. Every transfer, every receipt is mine. But she only sighed, that heavy sigh that made me feel like a child throwing a tantrum. That's when the gaslighting really took root. He began talking to family, spinning the story his way. I heard from a cousin that he'd described me as irresponsible and paranoid for not appreciating all he'd done to secure the apartment for me. My own mom gently suggested maybe I'd misinterpreted things. It was like being trapped in a hall of mirrors. Every protest I made came back distorted. I was cast as ungrateful, unstable, dramatic. Meanwhile, he got to play benevolent protector, the man who reluctantly stepped in for her own good. And yet, the daily humiliations piled up. One evening, I came home and found the recycling bins already rolled out to the curb. I hadn't done it. He had. Another day, the thermostat was mysteriously changed. Each tiny intrusion was a reminder that my lock might as well have been made of paper, that my life inside these walls wasn't truly mine to close off. I started keeping my blinds drawn tight. I began leaving shoes piled deliberately by the door, hoping the mess would deter him from dropping by. I locked everything twice, though it didn't matter. Keys ignore locks. The more I pushed back, the more he painted me as unstable. The war wasn't just in my apartment anymore. It was for my credibility. But I didn't fully grasp just how much damage his narrative had done, until the day my neighbor caught me crying in the hallway and told me she'd overheard what he said about me to the landlord. Shall I write the next chapter? I'll never forget the embarrassment in that hallway. I was crouched near my door, trying to juggle groceries while wiping tears off my face with the back of my wrist. That's when my neighbor, the one who had witnessed him walking in before, paused with her mail in her hand. I don't want to intrude, she whispered gently, but you should know what he's been saying downstairs. Her words made my stomach twist. She looked around as if making sure no one else was listening. I overheard him telling the landlord you're just crashing in the unit. He made it sound like you can't pay reliably, that you're essentially under his care. He said he needed the lease in his name so he can keep things under control. I swear, I felt the blood drain out of my face. My groceries slipped against my hip as I leaned against the wall for balance. He wasn't just gaslighting me privately. He was performing it publicly, strategically twisting the story so anyone who mattered would doubt my independence. "Are you sure?" I whispered. She nodded. "Positive." The landlord looked hesitant, but he didn't argue. He acted like this was the arrangement all along. My hands began to shake. Suddenly, all those smug little texts, the random notes, the adjusted thermostat made sense. They weren't just petty intrusions. They were part of the larger story he was spinning. That I was incapable, careless, a child who still needed him to regulate everything. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me, my mind exploding with rage. He wasn't just holding the lease. He was smearing me in the shadows, positioning me as someone undeserving of tenancy. He was creating evidence for the day he'd yank the rug out from under me. My immediate thought was to confront him, but a tiny voice inside warned me not to just rely on emotion anymore. If he was building a case, then I'd need proof of my own, proof of every rent payment transfer in my name, proof of his unwanted entries, proof that he was manipulating the landlord. I pulled out my bank app and began taking screenshots of every rent transaction tied directly to me. Then I saved each one, labeling them by date. I photographed his sticky note. I dug the envelopes out of the trash, just in case I needed those too. I wasn't just a rattled tenant anymore. I was a tenant preparing for war. But the war twisted in a way I hadn't expected when I finally went down to the landlord's office to propose a lease transfer on my own. Because that's when I discovered that even paper trails weren't enough. Since on paper, the power still belonged fully to him. Shall I write the next chapter? I walked into the leasing office, clutching a folder so tightly, my nails bent against the manila edges. Inside were screenshots of my bank transfers, photos of notes he'd left, even the torn-open envelope that had arrived with his name printed at the top. I thought if I just laid out the facts, the truth would unravel cleanly. The landlord's secretary ushered me to a chair with a smile too polite to mean anything. When the landlord finally appeared, he looked vaguely uncomfortable, as though he already knew why I was there. "I'd like the lease transferred into my name," I said firmly. "I've been the one paying rent directly every month. I can show you records." I slid the folder across the desk, my hands damp with sweat. He flipped through it slowly, nodding along, but then he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I understand you've been paying rent, yes," he said, voice heavy. "But the problem is, the lease is legally in his name. Any change requires his consent. It's not a unilateral process. His consent. That single condition stopped me cold. I leaned forward, but I live there, alone. He comes in without permission. He uses keys. You know he doesn't belong there anymore." The landlord looked down at his folded hands. He explained that situation differently. He said you're his dependent, and he's responsible for the property. Without his signature, I can't process a transfer. It was like a punch to the gut. That word again, dependent. He'd sold the exact narrative I feared most, and now it had roots in official documents. "So you're saying," I whispered, my throat tight, "that even though I've held up my end, even though my money has kept that apartment going, he can block me from having any rightful claim?" The landlord's pause was enough. When I got back to my apartment that night, I collapsed against the doorframe, shaking with a mixture of fury and dread. My mind raced. I had no power unless I got his signature, and he was the last person who'd ever give it. And worst of all, he knew it. That's why he smirked when he used those keys. That's why he left notes like little flags of ownership. Because he knew he had me trapped in an arrangement he'd engineered from the start. I tried to sleep, but anger carved a canyon into my chest. If official channels wouldn't protect me, then I needed another way to expose him. Something undeniable. something that proved beyond legalese and gaslighting that I was more than a dependent living under his leash. And then, almost as if the universe had been waiting for me to break, I stumbled across something buried in yet another accidental delivery. Proof that revealed just how intentional his hold over me really was. Shall I write the next chapter? The next delivery came on a rainy Tuesday, when I was hunched at my desk, trying to make sense of my finances. The courier left a thick envelope at my door, once again addressed to him. My pulse spiked the moment I saw his name. Part of me wanted to shove it straight into the trash, but some instinct told me to open it. Inside was a letter from building management, neatly folded and stamped with their letterhead. At first glance, it read like a standard policy update, but then one paragraph caught my eye, and my hands went cold. It was in response to his written request. Formal language confirming that the lease had been intentionally kept under his name to ensure accountability for a dependent occupant. My stomach churned as I reread those words. This wasn't a clerical oversight or a forgotten signature. He had engineered it. He had deliberately positioned himself as my legal tether, my silent gatekeeper, even after the divorce. I dropped the papers on the table and pressed my palms into my eyes, heat rising in my chest. So every smug smile, every key jingling entry, every snide text about taking care of it. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't lingering by accident. It was by design. He had gone out of his way to claim me as dependent again, as if I hadn't spent years clawing free from that exact word. The betrayal sank deeper than any earlier intrusion. This wasn't about rent or responsibility. It was about power, about keeping me small enough to fit under his thumb, even when the marriage that tied us was dead. I wanted to scream into the walls. Instead, I grabbed my phone and started snapping pictures of every line on that letter. This wasn't just proof of manipulation. It was the blueprint. All I had to do was string the dots together into a story that would strip away his mask. But that night, staring at the confirmation in black and white, I knew I was crossing a line myself. If I exposed him, I wouldn't just be defending my autonomy. I'd be declaring a war loud enough for my mother, the landlord, and maybe even the wider family to hear. And if I was going to make that move, it meant tearing away whatever fragile peace existed between us. It meant openly choosing a side. The question was, did I have the courage to strike first? Shall I write the next chapter? I woke up the next morning with the envelope spread across my coffee table like a crime scene file. The rain outside had painted streaks across my windows, and the whole apartment smelled like damp cardboard from half-unpacked boxes. My eyes kept tracing the same sentence over and over. Dependent occupant. It made my skin crawl. That's what I'd been reduced to, on paper. His dependent. It didn't matter that I was paying bills, juggling freelance work, making ends meet in my own way. In his story, I could only ever orbit him, a powerless satellite bound to his gravity. Something snapped in me then. I pulled out a battered notebook and started writing everything down. Dates, times, bank transfer amounts, the text messages, the neighbor's testimony about what she overheard. Piece by piece, I laid out the entire mosaic of his control. It felt less like journaling and more like loading ammunition. Still, the risk hit me like a wave. Taking this to tenants' rights advocates, or even the landlord again, meant burning every bridge he'd built around me. My mom, especially. She would see it as me going too far. I could already hear her disappointed sigh, that familiar cutting line of hers. Why can't you just let him help? But help didn't feel like this. Help wasn't walking into an adult daughter's apartment uninvited, wasn't posing as the leaseholder to string her security along like a puppet. Help was honesty, respect, boundaries. He knew none of those words. As I sat there, scrolling through my screenshots and staring at his smug replies, a wave of clarity hit. If I stayed quiet, I'd lose this apartment sooner or later, either by eviction or by the erosion of my sanity. Speaking up was a gamble, yes, but silence was a guarantee of loss. I decided then I would go to a tenants' rights union. They could tell me what was possible beyond the landlord's shoulder shrugging. If anyone could validate my standing as the rightful occupant paying in good faith, it would be them. Heart thudding, I sat at my laptop and drafted a long email to the advocacy center. Hitting send felt like exhaling after drowning, but sending it meant there was no going back. The ball was out of my hands. The war I'd been fighting quietly in my head was about to go public. And when the union called me back with a plan, I realized just how dangerous, but also how liberating, the next step would be, confronting him face to face, with evidence stacked against him like a tower he couldn't kick down. Shall I write the next chapter? The tenants' rights counselor on the phone had a calm, steady voice, the kind people use when coaxing someone from the edge of panic. She listened to every detail: how the rent was coming from my account, how he had entered without consent, how the lease was a trap he'd engineered to maintain control. When I finished, there was a silence long enough for me to hear the buzzing of my fridge. Then she said, "You have more power than you think. In our state, the person proving consistent rent payments can petition to be recognized as the legal tenant, regardless of who's listed on the original paperwork. If you've got receipts, texts, even witnesses, you can wrestle this away from him." It was like someone had cracked a window in a suffocating room. Hope and fury mixed, burning in my chest. "But it won't be quiet," she added gently. "If he's gone to these lengths, he'll fight. You need to be braced for open confrontation." Open confrontation. The words sat heavy in my mouth. I hung up and stared around my apartment. My books stacked precariously on shelves, my blankets thrown over the couch, the framed photo of me and my mom years ago grinning in a kitchen that wasn't ours anymore. Every piece of this place screamed, mine. By the time I called him, my voice no longer wavered. "You, me, the landlord's office, tomorrow. Bring the paperwork you've been hiding. We clear this up now." He laughed down the line, that oily laugh that used to end every argument before it began. "Why are you dragging this into the open? We both know you can't manage without me. What are you proving?" "You'll find out tomorrow," I said, and hung up. That night, I barely slept. I laid out my folder. Bank transfers going back 6 months. Photos of every note he'd left in my apartment. Even the neighbor's written statement she'd bravely signed after overhearing him bragging to the landlord. It was my arsenal, my shield. But beneath my resolve slithered fear. He was charming. He was manipulative. What if he twisted it all into some story about me being a hysterical girl, trying to cut out the only stable presence in her life? I pressed my palms to the table, whispering to myself over and over, "You have proof. You have proof." And when I finally walked into that office the next day, folder clutched tight, the air thick with my ex-stepfather's smirk already waiting for me, I knew there was no turning back. Because this time, for the first time, I wasn't walking in empty-handed. Shall I write the next chapter? He was already there when I pushed open the glass door to the landlord's office. Sitting smugly in the waiting chair, leg crossed over knee, he looked like he had been rehearsing this moment for weeks. His arms spread wide when he saw me, as if this were some kind of family reunion rather than the battleground it was. "You made this bigger than it needed to be," he muttered as I passed him. I ignored him and went straight to the landlord's desk, setting my folder down with a loud, deliberate smack. My pulse was thundering, but my voice was steady as I addressed both of them at once. We're going to get this clear right now. I'm not his dependent. I am the tenant here. The landlord's gaze shifted nervously between us, as though he'd been dreading this. My ex-stepfather leaned back with a thin smile and said smoothly, "She's emotional. She doesn't mean that. I've been managing her living situation to keep things stable. Ask her mother, she'll tell you the same. It was an old tactic. Speak calm, brand me dramatic. But for the first time, I didn't flinch. I opened the folder, sliding out papers one by one, like cards in a game I was destined to win. Here are 6 months of rent transfers, I said, each sheet landing with a decisive slap on the wood. All from my bank account to the property office. Here are photos of the notes he's left inside my home, which clearly show unauthorized access. And here, I pulled the stapled page from the bottom, my hands no longer shaking, is a signed witness statement from my neighbor, confirming he told you I was just crashing. That is a lie. I've been paying and living there alone. The landlord leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the documents. For the first time, the smug curve of his mouth faltered. He shot up in his chair. You can't just parade gossip around. She's unstable. Everyone knows it. I've had to step in because she can't. Because I can't what? I cut him off, my voice sharp enough to slice through the air. Sign my own lease? Live without your name hanging over me like a curse? You engineered this so you could keep me trapped, and it ends today. The silence that followed cracked like thunder in my ears. My landlord's eyes settled on me, then on the neat trail of evidence laid out piece by piece. Slowly, he leaned back and exhaled. I'll need to run this by legal, he said carefully, but these payments are indisputable. If she's been sustaining the lease herself, she has the right to claim tenancy. At minimum, she is a legal occupant with protective rights. The look on my ex-stepfather's face, pure rage barely hidden behind practiced calm, was almost worth the nightmare it took to get here. Almost. But the fight wasn't over. His control wouldn't crumble gracefully, and I could see it burning in his eyes. He wasn't done. The question now was, how explosive would the fallout be once the decision became official? Shall I write the next chapter?